It's my great pleasure to introduce today's joint City of London and City Property Association's MIPIM seminar and the launch of the report called Future Workstyles and Future Workplaces in the City of London. The report is going to be presented by Despina Katsikakis for Ramadas Consulting, and I'm looking forward to the comments then of 2 minutes each from our distinguished panelists who will respond to the issues raised by the report. We have Mark Ridley, the Vice President of the City Property Association and Commercial Director at Stanhopes, Duncan Swinhoe, Managing Director of Gensler, Jack Pringle, Managing Director, Pringle, Brandon, Perkins and Will, Eric van der Clay, Head of Level 39 at Canary Wharf, Philip Lewis, Chief Executive for Property of the Kirsch Group. Today's seminar is an opportunity to discuss the changing nature of work styles and the evolving workforce in the city, which would have implications for workspaces and the public realm. Office space requirements are changing, as well as the importance of other factors that will influence business future location decisions. We're going to discuss the findings of the study commissioned by the City of London Corporation and the City Property Association, examining how the City of London can meet the needs of its future businesses and workforce to maintain its position as a competitive and attractive location. The report discusses on how the world of work is changing, and in particular the consequences for the city, with its dense concentration of financial and professional services, its young and highly skilled workforce, and the diverse range of workspaces where ancient and modern sit side by side. We think the findings include some rather practical implications for developers and property managers in ensuring that office buildings and design are fit for the future. Enough of an introduction. Can I now invite Despina to present her findings?
Thank you very much, Mark. This has been a really great report to do, particularly for me personally, because I did a report for the city 30 years ago called The Changing City, which looked at what the impact of deregulation would have on the City of London. And of course, as you know, that led to great development of many different types of buildings, deeper floor plates, a lot of change in the city. And so going back and talking to, I think we spoke to over 40 occupiers, investors, developers, was really, really interesting. And first of all, getting their perception of how they see the city and the current context of the city. And overwhelmingly, everyone came back and said, well, the city improves all the time. The experience continues to improve year by year, and it is the place to be. And that is a quote I found very, very interesting, because that kind of emotional connection of the city as the center of commerce was really quite important. And part of it was around the mix, the diversity, the heritage and new buildings, and that differentiation of place it offers. It's important to remember that over 50% of the space in the City of London was developed or renovated after 1997. So we're really talking about an incredibly new amount of building stock with some very important characteristics. The other thing that's also interesting is that of the occupied units in the City of London, about half of them are less than 5,000 square feet, and only about 2% are over 100,000 square feet. So that, I think, is an interesting perception that often people think of the city as very, very large occupiers. And one of the things we wanted to understand is what the employment context is and what is it likely to be. The city has had and will continue to have very steady employment growth. Employment is projected to increase by another 50,000 new jobs in the next 10 years, and it has 50% higher output per job than central London, which is really, really interesting. And I think that predominantly comes from the fact that the characteristics of the workforce are very different. You actually have a much higher ratio of managers and professionals, 68% compared to just over 50% in central London and close to 35% across the UK. So you see a very different character of worker in the city. The organizations in the city are actually also very, very diverse. And what is interesting with the organizations is the way they are changing, the way they're becoming much more leaner, much more agile, and how the whole business ecology of the city will continue to have strong cross-company dependencies as opposed to intercompany dependencies. I think that's an important point that I'd like to come back to. But what we found fascinating is that, first of all, out of the 15,000 enterprises in the City of London, 98% of them are less than 250 people. And that scale continues to shift and change. And the other thing that is certainly a significant difference when I compare it to 30 years ago is that in the past, we used to talk a lot about the different characteristics of sectors, how professional services varied from technology firms, from financial services firms. One of the things we found in this report is that sectoral characteristics are actually blurring. Tech firms are not very different to banks. In fact, banks are competing for talent from all the big tech firms. FinTech is bringing those together in a new combination of work patterns. So we're seeing a very, very different sense of permeability across companies. And I'm going to talk about three themes that are framed through the employment. The notion of agility, because corporations, to stay competitive, need to be restructuring constantly. The notion of connectivity, and I'll refer to this throughout the presentation, and this notion of permeability in terms of both organizational structures and what it means to physical space. I think they are the three really important elements in terms of what will impact the city. We've heard a huge amount about the changing workforce, and the city sits at the forefront of that. The city has a much more highly skilled, highly trained, and younger workforce than anywhere else in London. And what's interesting with that younger workforce is that 50% of the city's workforce tends to fall into what we would call Gen Y, born after 1979. And we felt that looking at this, we wanted to begin to understand, were there really these very, very different requirements across the generations? And again, I think we consistently found that the differences that have been talked about, I would say, are hyped up, and they're not really looking at the real issue. The real issue is that across generations, depending primarily on the stage of one's life, people want choice and flexibility. And a lot of what is happening with that is manifesting itself into a very different set of demands for occupiers. The new generations at work, as well as people at the other end of the demographic, like myself and others who want to continue working, actually are much more demanding about which organizations they will go to. So the notion of a job for life, an organization actually doing us a favor to employ us, is completely reversed in this new context. It's all about, what is the organization going to do for me? How is it going to increase my knowledge sharing, my career development, my focus? And that, again, sets a whole new set of demands. The work style implication is significant. We are really addressing this new sharing economy, a sharing economy across every level. Access to knowledge is becoming the number one and most significant aspect in organizations. And businesses are now interacting with one another in completely new ways. They're collaborating with competitors, with suppliers to come up with new ideas and innovation. Corporate structures are becoming flatter. They're actually looking to empower their employees to actually be able to work in a much more creative way. And what that begins to raise is a whole new set of blurring of work, life, leisure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because, again, that has major implications. The relationships within organizations and outside of organizations are critical. The focus on flexibility to attract the right skills through temporary, on-demand staff is becoming a key focus, not just in the city, but across and around the world. So this connectivity and agility and choice is really impacting the shape of organizations away from something I used to refer to as a corporate island into, again, a much more permeable organizational structure. So what does that mean in terms of actually how the boundaries of work impact on the demand of space? What we're seeing is a shift away from fixed work environments to much more flexible and on-demand space. If you look at the diagram on the left, we used to see that space would be made up of sort of 80% desk space and 20 to sometimes 30% meeting space. That has significantly shifted to being significantly more focused on collaborative space and embracing space beyond the building. And what we're seeing is that in the next 10 years, the space beyond the building, the ability of people to work elsewhere will be a significant factor. Every single one of the people we interviewed said they would look to ways to create spaceless growth. And that wasn't just as a way to reduce cost, but it's as a way of actually creating different types of environments. So the workplace solutions that allow for a combination of space, more flexible leases, new types of co-working, flexible, pay-as-you-go space will be increasingly important. I think one of the interesting things that if you think about the impact that technology has had, we increasingly have more user control over what we do. And if you think about where space is going, users increasingly will be able to access space through an app as and when they need it, whether they're within an organization or whether an organization itself. And already we're seeing examples of that with organizations like Liquid Space in the US who are providing space along those lines. Now, that also means very, very different, more flexible tenancy requirements. So a greater emphasis on flexible leases and much more focus on multiple users and multiple uses within buildings. So this notion that agile working is just something that happens occasionally is no longer valid. It is something that is happening as the norm. And that means that workplaces need to be designed for that continuous adaptability to support that. So we're beginning to explore new variations of work. And again, I think that plays really well into the characteristics of the city itself. That has, of course, very significant implications on the change in interiors. We're shifting into a much more the notion of what I would call a more loose fit office with a focus on activities, simple and neutral CAD/A kit of parts that revolves around supporting collaboration, knowledge, concentration, all highly enabled by technology to support virtual and face-to-face interactions. We're seeing increased densities and utilization. I have for years talked about how office buildings around the world, not just London, suffer from extreme overspecification and underutilization. And I think organizations are really embracing that. And 2008 and the financial pressures around that certainly shifted many CFOs to recognize that space was being underutilized and there was an opportunity there. Now that coupled with what it means to create space that is much more reflective of the ethos of the organization means the space can be an attraction and retention tool. But we're certainly going to be seeing the densities that would have been at about 17 square meters per person come down to the 10 square meters per person that we tend to design building capacity for. So rich variety, task-focused, and again, the opportunity to allow employees to hack the space, to reconfigure the space, to empower them over what they can do. A number of people talked about why aren't we removing ceilings to create more light and more space in buildings? Why do we need these drop ceilings? So again, simplicity, choice, flexibility seems to be the theme that comes out significantly in this. It also has implications on the evolving building typology. And I quite like this image from Maker Place because it takes a city building and reinvents it around patterns of human interaction. And thinking about buildings as ways that they can facilitate serendipitous encounters, I find a very interesting notion because it talks very much to the heritage of the city. The city actually was set up to allow individuals to exchange knowledge, information, ideas, and create commerce. And we're almost coming full circle back to that original reason why the city is an important place for business. And I think the buildings can begin to capture that. And I mentioned earlier this notion about diversity. And people love the diversity of buildings. And with a more flexible set of requirements, it allows us to reinvent existing heritage buildings in completely new ways with a lot less constraints. Increasingly, the focus is going to be on experiences, creating great experiences for people. And one of the predominant elements that we have seen, not just out of the research, but you will have seen it in the press, is this increased focus on health and well-being of people. And with that comes a real awareness of the impact of green and nature and how that can begin to make a positive contribution to the productivity of employees. And we've had some very, very interesting suggestions throughout this study of how we can begin to use green to actually create more living buildings and create more opportunities. And I'll come back to public realm issues that revolve around that, but I don't think we should be looking at nature as just something that's outside, but it's something that's inside and on the top of buildings, particularly in a constrained environment. But as we begin to design for what I would call more multidimensional workplace, which is not any longer about just physical buildings, we realize that corporate real estate is no longer about managing buildings, but it's actually about managing people. And the moment we do that, it means we need to create a more people-centric, integrated approach to the way corporate real estate is delivered. And this is something that every single corporate client I've ever worked with aspires to and struggles with because of the siloed nature of all of these corporate service areas. So corporate real estate, services, finance, human resources, procurement, and ICT typically don't talk to one another. They occasionally collaborate on projects, but they don't holistically look at an integrated approach. And everything that we have been looking at being the differentiator and the way that you can create experiences is through integrated thinking and an integrated approach. And again, this is where the city has a tremendous opportunity in being able to work with developers, architects, corporations, and bringing together that integrated thinking. So that brings us to the role of the city and the public realm. Every single person I spoke to, without exception, said the most important thing for us is the public realm. The office is no longer the office in the building. Work is extended into the public realm. And this is a really, really important area for the city to capture, to reinforce, because there are some wonderful public spaces in the city, but there's also enormous pressure because space is so small and tight. And this notion of the differentiating of experiences, everyone mentioned Leadenhall Market. You know, how amazing it is to be able to go into a heritage space that brings together a public space. But the city generally is seen as being very formal, very uninviting in terms of its public realm. And this is a great opportunity for the future because the formality is often about the ability to communicate the public spaces that already exist and to enhance them and to create more public spaces. So the emphasis on how you use leisure, amenities to activate public space, to create experiences, I think is one of the most important issues. And again, being able to soften the city to allow this greater permeability and also soften the buildings. I think Leadenhall Street's a very interesting example where the escalators allow this seamless transition from the public space into the lobby of the building. And that shows us opportunities about how we can begin to break down those barriers so the buildings do not just exist as isolated islands, but they become much more inviting extensions of the public space. So to summarize the thinking, the three elements, which is this diverse growth, the complex ecology, and greater choice, we felt lead to a much more connected, agile, and permeable both organizations and places. And what that means is that the emphasis on increased agility and connectivity means that the future workplace will be leveraging the virtual network, leveraging public realm, leveraging agile working to create much more connected places. The challenge we have is that we seem to consistently have this debate of either or, either people sitting at desks or working from home. And that is an unsustainable debate because the answer is we need both, not either or. So the traditional workplace, the corporate island, is no longer sustainable because organizations cannot stay competitive. So we need to embrace that and look at what it can mean in terms of corporate policy, building typology, city planning, and management. So some very direct elements and areas of interventions. Obviously, at the highest level, connectivity needs to be supported at every level. So the infrastructure of knowledge access, ubiquitous Wi-Fi, ubiquitous network connection is something that the city has been working very hard to achieve. And that's a really critical element. The other thing that's really important is a greater focus on quality and differentiation rather than quantity of space. People are not just interested in how many hundreds of thousands or millions of square feet. They're interested in the quality and the character of that. That's the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to reinvent older buildings, to look at multi-let buildings and enhance the variety of accommodation. This challenge of expansion through spaceless growth will underline the need for agile workplaces, and that has massive implications in the dynamic use of the city. And that also means that the city needs to encourage the economy of flexible and co-working spaces and create more opportunities. And also at the same time promote a new lifestyle approach to make the city much more welcoming to more diverse occupiers. Maximize opportunities for pedestrianization, cycle lanes, secure cycle parks, and promote more breathable, livable buildings, green living walls, winter gardens, active atria, and using the buildings within to support well-being. I mentioned providing fit-out solutions in which experience is the key part of the design agenda, and I think that will force the discussion with the occupiers and the developers to take a very different direction than it historically has. This idea of leveraging common areas and lobbies to support circulation and ensure greater permeability and connections. Continued emphasis on the improvement on the communication, design, and management of the public realm. And finally, there's a really big opportunity, which is, of course, Crossrail, and using Crossrail to reinforce the city's accessibility and diversity of amenities and lifestyle differentiation. So finally, the city said to us, well, what happens much further into the future? What could happen? And of course, none of us really know what could happen. We do know that we're probably going to have much more self-sustaining buildings. We're probably going to have much more automated and carbon neutral transport. I believe that the nature of work will have changed dramatically as artificial intelligence gets incorporated into the mainstream. But that's a very, very interesting one because that will create thousands of more and new opportunities of working. But nonetheless, whilst all of this is happening, the city still has the opportunity to leverage its heritage to provide a diverse mix of spaces and amenities to create compelling, memorable experiences. Because I think no matter where technology takes us, and no matter where we go in terms of organizational structures, the actual quality of exchange between individuals will become more and more important. Ideas are not generated through email or virtual communication. Innovation happens face-to-face. And this is where we will seek those experiences to be destinations that actually give us the right quality of environment. And that's where the City of London provides the right diversity to be able to respond to the challenge of agility, connectivity, and permeability of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Despina, for that. We're now going to have some very brief comments from our distinguished panelists before opening it up to everybody. So can I begin with Mark Ridley from the City Property Association and Stanhope? Mark.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think we should all frame these comments by just standing back to start with and saying, you know, if you look at City in terms of a place to do business and therefore measure its current success, and what's a way to measure an area to do business success, and you look at the GVA per person, it is the most amazingly successful place currently. It is way more successful on that measure than anywhere else in the UK, and probably there are very, very few places that can come close to matching it in the world. So the comments we're making here is about how to take something that's already really successful, but in a fast-paced and rapidly changing world, making sure it stays right at the forefront on a global basis. And I think Despina's presentation and paper was very thought-provoking and touched on a lot of things that I agree. And I think we agree with, and rather than commenting the whole thing, just to focus in on one particular area that I think is important for all of us to concentrate on, and that's the ground plane. And I say ground plane and not public realm, and I'll come on to that in a second, because I think the key thesis, one of the key things that have come out from this, which we all intrinsically know, is that people, in terms of an office now, where their place of work actually physically, as we talked about, at their desk or in their physical tenanted area, a lot of people, they're 50% of the time there, and 50% of the time they're working on the way to going, getting a sandwich, meeting a friend, going and sitting in some nice cafe and brainstorming on something. Their office is the physical office, but also everything around them. And so that is why we all have to work together on the ground plane. And I think the city really understand that. And I think it is not just about the city, it's about us. And I think if we just drill into two bits of that before I pass over, I think for me, the ground plane, one of the key things for the city to do, and they are doing it and they understand it, is to continue to unwind the car-based post-war obsession that drove a lot of planning. So talking about permeability, stitching the city back into London, which is very, very important. You think of the Aldgate roundabout, which is a real barrier between the city and a lot of what's really interesting in terms of the new economy going on. And by taking the plunge and sorting that out, which I know the city are doing with other bodies, that is going to be a key measure. So I think that still needs to be worked on as hard as possible. London Wall, I know it's another one where I think it's now official policy to bring that back down to a single lane. It doesn't go anywhere, that dual carriageway anyway, and stitch, what effectively was dividing the city back together again and bring it back to a human scale. I think the holy grail of that is probably the banking to change, and there are many, many people who are much, much more able than me who I know it's a big issue, but I think that is the holy grail at the heart of the city if it can be sorted. The final point is come back to the point, it's ground plane. I think what we don't do well in the city compared to New York is this ground plane idea. I find whenever I go to New York, what strikes me is the public realm is the outside, but it's also the inside of most buildings. So a lot of buildings are designed to be permeable. So you can be outside walking through to somewhere, or you can cut through a building and there's an interesting cafe there or a restaurant you can sit down. And I think, and I suspect it's possibly because of the security issues that we've had here over the time. But it's time to look at it again. And I think where we as developers can help the city, the ground plane, is being more creative about what we do with our ground floors and making sure that that's part of the public fabric.
Thank you, Mark. Now Duncan Swinhoe from Gensler.
Good morning. Well, I think it's a wonderful presentation this morning, and I think a lot of the themes in here we very strongly echo, and I think they identify the way things are changing. I think what's central to all of this, and what's really interesting when you see it on the presentation, is that the topic being work styles and how people work, but actually it's all about the space around buildings, the environment between buildings. Public realm's been taught permeability and porosity, and I think what's very interesting about this is that at the center of all of these conversations, it's a person. It's a very interesting time in the way that we work, and I think that businesses that are most successful are the ones that are recognizing that actually bringing out the latent potential of people is the route to success. And I think that this idea of connectivity, permeability, agility, recognizing that there's a whole range of different generations in the workplace. And I think sometimes actually the generational thing is a little bit of a red herring actually, because I think it's more about personality types in many ways. You could be an introvert at 18 years old or an introvert at 80 years old. And I think there's more similarities around personality types maybe than generational. So I think that where this relationship between work and people and the city is going forward is that it's talking about the city actually is the office. You know, you don't work just in your workspace, but actually we're all connected. It's something that we need to work out how to manage that, I think, in the future generations, that they don't become all consumed by work. But this idea that work happens everywhere, and I think where that puts the city itself is that the space between buildings is incredibly important to the success of the businesses that are there. And we mentioned Leadenhall as an example. Aon are the key anchor tenant that's moved into the Leadenhall building. They actually chose to move from Chicago actually to London. And two of the key reasons that were behind that was London's global position, so its time and its networks and its ability to connect into these new emerging markets. But it was talent. It's the clustering of talent that comes into these places. And people are clustering not just about co-location of like-to-like businesses, but it's the experience of being there. You can have a choice. You know, do I want to spend my time in San Francisco or New York or London? And I think the city competitiveness is becoming much, much more important in the success of businesses. So I think understanding people, understanding the relationship of how people experience the cities that they're in is the future. And I think actually the piece at the end about 2050, when you look ahead, I think the technology element is I mean, I'm sure Eric will talk to this a little bit further, but the automation of processes and the vast rapid growth in the ability to process means actually that people are freed up from some of these more mundane menial tasks, and therefore idea creation is becoming much, much more valuable, and again how to enhance and help that to happen. I think you see this a little bit in some of the co-working accelerators actually, where the relationship and the way that you bring different people together in different environments actually stimulates different types of behavior. So I think understanding people is definitely one of the key themes, and I think some of these terms that Despina has identified today are absolutely spot on.
Thanks, Duncan. Now Jack Pringle from Pringle, Brandon, Perkins and Will.
Thank you very much. Despina, I think this is a great report, and much of it really resonates with what we see with individual projects on the ground. It seems to me that it adds up. I'd like to talk about two aspects of it. First of all, the workforce and what that means to offices. And secondly, reinforcing points made elsewhere about the public realm. In the workforce, we perhaps see even an exaggerated version of the picture you paint. When we ask the average age of some of our major clients, it's often around 28 to 30 years old. That means half of them are in their 20s, which is absolutely quite extraordinary. And when we look at who they want to hire, a lot of the businesses that we work for are now really more focused on IT skills and IT platforms than perhaps they were 20 years ago, when there was perhaps more about managerial issues. So, for example, 20 or 30 years ago in financial dealing rooms, it was the barrow boy who was coming as a sort of deal maker. And then as the investment banks grew gradually around the investment community, it became the graduates. But now it's the IT community they're after, because what they're doing is creating algorithms for automatic trading. And so they want the same people that Google want, they want the same people that Facebook want, etc. And these young people don't want to come and work in tin ceiling land. They don't want to come and work in a corporate environment. And whereas, again, a generation or two ago, we would expect the graduates to conform to the corporate culture, right now the game is the corporate culture has to adapt to the graduate culture. So we're seeing this push for buildings that are much more characterful. We were involved in the Macquarie project with Clive Wilkinson, and I think that's a game changer, communicating vertically throughout a building, mixing its community, providing really interesting spaces that people want to be in, that stimulates conversation and interaction. So that's what we want. We see the rise of wellness as well. The old paradigm was, we'll insure you medically, and when you get ill, we'll fix you. The new paradigm is, we'll help you to never get ill. You come to a really great building that keeps you fit. On a utilitarian note, our buildings are being used, actually, I think at twice the density they were before. I think you had 17 metres squared down to 10. I think when you take into account that nobody was actually in the buildings, it's more like 24 metres down to 10. So buildings are being used at twice the rate they were. So actually, the lifts don't work anymore. And we're going to see people driving a lot more lift shafts into existing buildings because they just can't cope. Finally, a quick word on the public realm. I completely agree. The activity-based working means the city is part of the activity. I know the city's been doing an enormous amount, bringing in shops. It's a shopping centre now where it never used to be. I know what's happening in London Wall. I know what's happening at Aldgate. We can see what's happened at Broadgate. We've seen what's happened around the place. Spitalfield's another one we were involved in. But actually, it's still a long way to go. You look at the city compared to continental cities, and it isn't very friendly at the ground plane. All of those buildings are fortresses. So I think actually, although there's a huge amount being done already, this public realm thing is going to be the key issue going forward for the city. The developers will handle their buildings, but the city's got to deal with the public realm because the public realm is now the workplace.
Thank you. Eric van der Klee from Level 39.
Thank you. So the thing that I'm going to focus on is the technology, obviously, the tech aspects, and what are the tech workers of today wanting and demand. Just to share some ideas with you and some terminology that we should all start getting used to, because it's completely different terminology from that which was shared before. But first, actually, I just want to pick up on something that Despina said, which I really loved. You spoke about the mixing of heritage space with new and modern opportunities, and we've just did a terrific example of that by collaborating with City of London Corporation and Canary Wharf Group over something called the FinTech Global Summit. This is effectively the Davos, if you like, for the FinTech industry, which we're trying to convene in London. And it's terrific, by the way, seeing City of London with 800 years of experience in this kind of thing, collaborating with Canary Wharf Group, with got, I think 30 years of experience in this sort of thing. So it is a really good example of getting together. And what we're doing is shining a light on the next generation of businesses, the next banks, the next financial services sector. But let me now describe some of the stuff that they do that we need to think about when we're building space. It's connected with the type of technology that they use, as well as this concept of spaceless growth. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Despina, because it's a problem for us in real estate, if I can put it that way, because spaceless growth you can't really charge a rent for, right? So what does that mean? What is spaceless growth? So we have 171 young companies at Level 39, developed there and attracted there of just 2 years, that have become fairly strong as a core example of the next generation of tech companies and what they need. And we asked Gensler to help us to design it because they were able to help us draw a slider between Facebook and a bank, and somewhere in the middle, maybe one click towards Facebook, was what the physical space was. And they did a terrific job, I'll say that, in helping us with that. But the most used spaces are not those which we thought. The spaces that are used are for things like stand-up meetings. Stand-up meetings are once a day stand-up meetings, no chairs, that you stand and therefore very quickly get through the items you need to get through. Okay, so when you're designing and building, those places need to be small, near coffee, very important that they're near coffee. In fact, stand them around a coffee island is also a very good idea to do that. But then there's other things that we're doing, which are, we're working on products called Slack. And I don't know if anybody, can anybody raise your hand who's heard of Slack? Anybody in this place? 2, 3. That's very good, by the way. It's a high number. It really is. So right now, just so you know, I mean, it's a bit strange for people to understand, but today, right now, as we speak, although I'm sitting here on this panel, I'm actually in 2 meetings back in Canary Wharf through something called Slack. And I'm fully updated on it. It means I look like I'm slightly distracted, but it means that I don't need to go to those meetings. I'm much more efficient, and the sign-offs and decisions that I need to do in those meetings are being done. So learn about Slack, figure it out, and provide spaces that people can do Slack meetings. Now, it isn't just Slack, there's other terms like that. These are meetings that are called Slack huddles, and scrums. That's the next word, scrums, which is about agile development. And people do sprints. So that means you need small areas that teams can get together. It's 4 people. It's 4 or maybe 5 people with a moderator that they can get together and do a sprint. And a sprint can be maybe 2 weeks. So what does this mean? This is a whole new taxonomy, isn't it, for real estate? But it's worth soaking it up and imbibing it, or visiting, some of the. I think it's a great idea to visit some of the incubators, because they have got a lot of innovators doing that. And we're starting to see the bigger companies like the banks coming to us to say, can you help us set up our lab? There's a lot more information, but I think I'll kind of stop there because it's too many new words, isn't it?
Far too many, Eric. But I've decided that our planning committee will in future meet without chairs. And,
Yes.
Philip Lewis Philip Lewis from the Cash Group.
Thank you, Mark. I'm worried about Slack, sprinting and scrums. Thank you very much. One of the most interesting comments I thought Despina made was that the city apparently is the place to be. And of all the years I've been coming to MIPIM, this is one of the very few occasions I've ever attended a seminar. And the fact that we've got a full house, to me, suggests that the city still is the place to be. And I think that it's become incredibly competitive. And over the last few years, more glamorous locations popped up for various different reasons. The city was the original place for the commercial core, and yet over the years, some folks went off to more glamorous parts of the West End and Mayfair, some went down the M4, and then, of course, we've seen King's Cross, Canary Wharf, more recently Stratford, and suddenly the city has become physically the absolute centre again. And one thing that I don't think has been stressed enough is the transport. As far as we're concerned, we own the Tower 42 estate, which includes, one of the original skyscrapers. There's 2 things that matter to us from a property investment and development perspective. One is the tenants, the occupiers are the most important ingredient. And the second is how people move around in London. And Liverpool Street, with the Central Line and the Main Line station, of course, was pretty important. But Crossrail is absolutely changing the way London works. And the great thing about the city is it has a Crossrail station at Liverpool Street, which is going to make all of that east-west movement so easy. So we've seen the newer occupiers like Google, and although they've gone to King's Cross, Amazon, Yahoo and others coming back into the centre, which means all of those smaller businesses will locate back in the centre. And I think the city's been incredibly clever, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of that detail in a minute or two. As far as we're concerned, we're delighted that public realm is close to this new agenda, because when we bought the Tower 42 estate, we managed to include, or it was included in 2.25 acres of freehold land, 2 large walkways either side of the tower. And we're in discussions with the city. A planning application hopefully will be approved next month, which includes a new office building on Bishopsgate, but more importantly, having heard this morning's discussion, 2 terrific areas of public realm on the ground to create really active ground floor retail for the kind of spaces that my colleagues have all been discussing, and an upgraded park behind the City of London club where people can sit, have a coffee, listen to some music, look at some artwork. And I'm delighted that that seems to be the thing that everybody's looking to achieve, along with their more flexible work time.
Thanks very much. That's been 5 really helpful contributions. From the city's perspective, public realm has been vital as far as we've been concerned, and I think it's what helps to make the city so attractive. People, a bit of mention of transport, but when I used to come in every day and go back every day, as opposed to spending now every day and every night in the city, I could be spending 2 hours on the Metropolitan line, which I love deeply. And, that is also work time, as you can see, and we have splendid new Metropolitan line trains now. Pity they took out half the seats. But they are an improvement. And I think we need to think about the comfort of people coming into and out of London, because now, with some of the difficulties we've got in the short term with transport at London Bridge, you know, a really nice walk to work and having a cappuccino on the way and a nice office is compensated by a scrum, not your scrum, a different scrum at London Bridge. Right, comments, questions from the floor, as blunt as you like, within reason. This one here first, then down here.
I've got a very specific, detailed question.
Yep,
Can you hear me?
yep.
So, great to hear about the focus on public realm. I think it's obvious, really, that and sort of the most enduring parts of the city, not just the city, but any city, are the bits that aren't there. However, we're here at a real estate conference, and so people have to make money out of property. And I've been posed a question on a few buildings, so I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. But I want to know, and this goes to anyone who wants to answer it, and if you don't come forward, I'll just pick one of you. How do you rentalise a lobby?
Right. Quick answers, how do you rentalise a lobby?
I'm happy to answer that because we own one. You have to factor in the general rental tone of the building. You know, if it's got a tiny, inaccessible, impossible lobby, probably your occupiers aren't going to be overly happy, and instead of paying £100, they'll only pay £90.
Yep.
On the other hand, if it's a terrific, accessible lobby that everybody loves, you might get a premium from your tenants who want to be able to access and impress their visitors. I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I'd maybe suggest that the idea of a lobby actually needs to change. This idea that there's some sort of security barrier between the street and the lift bank. I think that's the nature of what this is about, actually. What is the connection between the businesses and the occupiers inside of these buildings and the world on the outside? And I think this idea of porosity and permeability, which is also on how businesses are relating to each other, same as people, I think that idea, the concept of a lobby, is actually quite dated in many ways. And I think that's the thing we should be exploring.
Yep.
It's actually, I think that's a great point, because if you think about the description of buildings that I made, is if we should really be thinking of buildings as vertical cities, and how far the public space goes into the building. I mean, I showed roofs that could be public spaces on top of buildings. So I think that the level of porosity and permeability is something that we're going to see shift significantly, and it will come back to what is the quality and differentiation of experience that will enable your tenants to pay a premium for being in that space and having that experience.
Okay. Yeah.
David Hart, Momentum Transport Planning. I was probably a question more for the author. Just in terms of the research that you did, and we're picking up on the theme that you've been talking about transport capacity and people getting to and from, and that being part of your working day, getting to and from the office. Was there anything in your research that picked up on changing working hours to try and sort of spread that out in any way?
Thank you so much for raising that, actually, because I forgot to mention it, because there were a number of occupiers that we spoke to that actually said that in the context of the city, there would be a great opportunity for the city and transport and organizations to give incentives to people to work different hours and spread the work times to reduce congestion. And that came up several times, and the issue of congestion around public transport was a significant one. So, yes.
Yeah. I live, when I occasionally get home, just outside the city, and there's a great rush for the 9:32 train from the elderly people who now commute in, able to take advantage of the lower fares after 9:30. Michael, and then at the back.
Michael Welbeck. I'm the chairman of the City of London Planning Committee. And the buildings are the easy bit for me in my task. They're the easy bit. We've got talented people who have produced great buildings. The real problem is the spaces between the buildings. That is our responsibility. And we have a very precious, finite amount of ground space. And I think really we want to remember, not only from the developers, but from TfL, the remarkable report, the Roads Task Force report, which started bringing into the public arena that the roads are not just for the movement of traffic. They are there as places in their own right. And that's where it started. We started a little before with street scene, but of course that is rather archaic idea now that we try to beautify the streets. Now streets are places to use. But how do we expand the amount we've got? It's finite. And of course, this is where the point about making buildings permeable, that's the only place we can really start expanding the ground space. And so it's a very important move to see how they can be made permeable. And we've got the security, damn the security. Let people move through. Let them be their own police force. Let them people move through, is my view.
Thank you.
And to talk about security, or not permeability, one of the disgraceful examples is, of course, the Guildhall Yard in front of the Guildhall. How do you get to it? Who knows about it? It's a great open space, and nobody managed to get there. And that's a disgrace to us, which we must put right, Mark.
Whose side are you on? As Michael will know, I've been a wild enthusiast for improving access to the Guildhall Yard over some years. I think it's a magnificent space. And my solution of demolishing St Lawrence Jewry Church didn't go down very well. But yeah, it's something we're working on. Yeah, views up, please, on that. And just worth commenting, if you take, say, the Bloomberg building, we're actually building into that a route straight through it, the old Watling Street, and that's an example, I think, Michael, of what you're talking about. But other thoughts?
Well, I think that's spot on, and you know, I think that is in many ways your top agenda. And there's lots of spaces at the roof of buildings coming up now, but that doesn't really do it. And I think the permeability at the ground plane is a solution, but I think also more pedestrianisation is a solution. Yep. You know, we've got lots of vehicle traffic going through very small streets. I think the simplification of the traffic management through the city would be very helpful, and just try and close some streets and give them to people.
We're doing Absolutely. That. Yep. Any other? Yep.
Just very briefly. I think, Michael, we've come on to it, and it was the point I made about permeability of buildings, and I'm sure there are security issues we will have to work through. But I think it is a two-way thing, because I think the City of London planning team can be helpful here in working with us to nudge things that way, so that we look at those ground floor spaces as developers in a different way. And I think you, with your strategic overview, have a valuable role to play in that.
Okay. Something towards the back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to carry on with exactly the same theme, actually, but just from a slightly different angle. I'm Nick Searle from Argent. We did some studies way back when. We looked at Covent Garden, and Covent Garden is more than 55% offices by use of the buildings. And yet have no concept of that because of the way the ground plane works. And there seems to be, within the city, a fundamental conflict between the requirement of developers stroke tenants for this huge corporate identity with great big plate glass windows and all the signage and everything else that goes with that, and what everybody's talking about here about being able to have permeable buildings. And just particularly, I guess, to Jack and Duncan, how are you going to overcome that? Because that is, all the while that exists, all the while we keep pandering to that perceived corporate requirement for a massive identity at the ground floor, we're never actually going to solve this problem.
Well, I think that goes back to, actually, that sort of dovetails to, I think, one of the first questions, how do you rentalise a lobby? And of course the answer is, you're not rentalising a lobby. The real question is, what's the value of a developer funding public space in their buildings? And the answer was the same. I think the answer was given, by one of the other panellists from Stanhope. In that it's worth it. Your building's going to become that much more attractive. I think you have to, corporate occupiers and developers need to think of themselves as part of some sort of commonwealth that they play their part in. And actually our overseas offices, in Seattle office, reports to us a really interesting thing going on there, that it's not just the ground plane in Seattle, it's the first floor as well. Sort of spreading up like rising damp, the public realm. It's because there just isn't enough room on the ground plane. So I think we've got quite a long way to go in understanding the real demand and the real attraction for these sort of spaces.
I think the West Coast is actually quite an interesting point to reference, actually, because I think the embracing of technology and the innovation that comes out of San Francisco in particular is world leading. And what you see for a lot of the businesses there, the ones that we've do a lot of work with actually, is that this idea of the ground plane is both about bringing in the supply chain, actually co-locating people who are not necessarily part of your business, but actually are essential to your business. And you see this a little bit around Bonhill Row at the back of Broadgate, at some of the Googleplex, or central working, where actually the lower levels of the building are actually open to anybody to participate in. Mm-hmm. And you'll go in there and you'll see people from BT, and you'll see big corporate occupiers, actually, just the people we're talking about, occupying those spaces because the adjacency to the type of people that are there is where creativity and ideas come from. So I think you'll see it will be driven by actually the occupiers, funny enough. I think they'll need to do that in order to be successful and remain at the head of what they're trying to do.
Yeah. I think the other the other difficulty is the fragmented ownership that you do get in parts of the city. Yeah. The great advantage you've got at King's Cross is you own it all, so you can you can decide where the people are going to wander. And in the city, that's not the case. We're lucky enough on Tower 42 to own the walkways between Old Broad Street and Bishopsgate, and I hope, with Michael's support, we'll get our planning consent next month and demonstrate exactly what we've been talking about this morning. That people will be able to wander around and go in and out of real active ground floor buildings, and the tenants upstairs will enjoy them just as much and will appreciate that there's no need to have a massive glass lobby downstairs that nobody uses. And it'd be interesting to see how your tenants shape up at King's Cross and whether they do what you've just been describing.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Yep.
Chris Churchman from Churchman Landscape Architects. I must say I've really enjoyed the last hour. It's been manna from heaven for us. But it is something we've been banging on about for the last 10 years. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, that office space was going to become boundaryless, and Wi-Fi was going to free up those spaces externally. So as a landscape architect, that's great. I mean, I think the question for us is, what is the delivery process for greening the city? And I think it has to be sort of multidimensional. Inevitably, it can come through individual developments, but I think it has to be that has to be matched by an integrated approach from on high, and that may be through the city, but it may need to come from a higher level. I mean, I went to a presentation 2 days ago where the mayor of Paris was presenting his vision of greening his city. So really, that is coming from the top. I think at the end of the day, this isn't just a case of throwing a few more trees into the city. Ecology, biodiversity is a very integrated system, and it does need a lot of thought and a lot of joined-up thinking to deliver what we actually all think is the right way to go.
There is no higher level than the city.
I'm obviously speaking to the right man.
Just from a city perspective, I think we do pretty well on that at the moment. It's not just about trees. We put in trees everywhere that we can, and little green spaces, that do make all of the difference. And I think we probably, I think that's as good as you'll get anywhere else. But I'd like other people to talk up the city.
I think you're in denial. No, I really do. I think you go to Montpellier, you go to Basel, you go to Barcelona, you see, what real public intervention in public spaces can do. It's on a massive scale. And I think, this is a UK-wide thing. I just don't think we realise how far we can go and how good we can get.
Are you going to speak up for the city?
Yes, why not? As we, coming from Canary Wharf, it seems a perfect thing to do. And I suppose what I would do is I'd just point to, you're gonna love this gentle commercial about Canary Wharf, in that both in our partnership in the city with 20 Fenchurch Street, we're learning what it's like to put public realm, this wonderful garden, on the top of a building. We're learning how to make that accessible in a safe way. And let's share those lessons, because that's incredibly important. I love that, because it's a perfect example of the collaboration between what we've done there and what we're doing. But of course, then in Canary Wharf on the Crossrail station, there's that amazing garden, which is having the most fantastic trees and greenery installed. And that's a station. How many stations have we got? We can probably do quite a lot with those. Of course, there's who's going to pay for it. But let's look at those examples and see what we can learn from them.
Okay. Anybody else on this?
It's a bit like the lobby question, really. If you can make the environment better, you're going to have many more satisfied occupiers than you would without it. As you probably know, behind Gibson Hall and adjacent to the City of London Club, there's a lovely, lovely green space. It doesn't get used quite enough. We're lucky enough to own it, and we're going to improve it. And it doesn't create any rent whatsoever, but it makes occupiers happy. As far as we're concerned, happy tenants pay the rent. And if we can create more of those kind of public spaces, whether they're green or not, that's exactly what we're looking to achieve. But wander through there, have a look at it. It's green, it's absolutely fantastic. It just needs to be used more.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. This is Lisa Webb from Gerald Eve. Just coming back to the point raised earlier about amenities and other facilities in the city. The city's obviously improved in terms of its diversity over the last few years, but there are also fantastic facilities on the edge of the city in terms of Spitalfields and Shoreditch. So the question really is just, can the city be doing more about blurring the boundaries between it and those fantastic areas that are right on its doorstep?
I think you've actually hit on something that's quite important that we don't talk about too much in the city, actually, is the cultural institutions that are, wonderful institutions that are somehow hidden away in parts of the Barbican and others. And I think when we get back to this conversation around experience, those kind of elements, and you move into around Smithfield and these different kind of components of the city, that cultural, artistic, those elements, I think, are hugely important. I think there's work that could be done there to make them more visible, more permeable, actually, in many ways. And I think that could help.
I think, Lisa, actually, the commercial imperatives means that over time that is going to happen. We talked about I talked about something about earlier on about what the city is doing strategically in terms of road network and Aldgate Union, which is a really important because that's a big barrier to a very interesting place. But I think if you look at places like Broadgate, sort of things in those, when that was conceived, by Stanhope in the 80s. It wanted to block everything north away. It was all focused back to the city. But I think, commercially, if you were doing that now, and Alpha Beta's scheme on Finsbury Square is a good example. Actually, you'd be orientating it at least as much to the other way and having permeability going north. So I think, if nothing else, commercial metrics will drive that openness over time because, as you say, it's increasingly interesting.
Just a thought from the city. Cultural, what we do culturally is incredibly important to us, and really we've gone to great lengths in the past to hide it. We have a magnificent Museum of London, and it was Boris Johnson, I think, who said he wrote a book when he went there, and he did it because he wanted to get away from everybody, that nobody would think he would do it there, and if they did, they couldn't find him anyway. We're conscious of that, and we are, that will be addressed in due course. The Barbican is, again, a splendid facility. We have the Guildhall School of Music and Drama with its new concert hall, which is probably acoustically the best in the country. And we are doing some work on what we're calling the cultural hub at the moment to see what we can do to make it more accessible, if I can put it that way. When you leave a magnificent concert at the Barbican, the walk down the Beat Street Tunnel is not the greatest. It is vastly improved because of what we've done on some lighting and other things there, but it's not great. So we're looking at that. In terms of the boundaries, we don't really believe in the boundaries because actually most people are not aware of them, and we certainly are not in the fortress city mentality. We absolutely work with our neighbouring boroughs. We have excellent relations with all of them, and we will continue doing that. But,
Just one issue. I don't think the culture is just about one big building. There's an initiative in the city which we're supporters of with others called Sculpture in the City. Some fantastic artwork that's put out every year. It's not just about one building. It's stuff you see as you amble around. And secondly, just about the boundaries. If you do go east, it's literally no more than 10 minutes walk east from Liverpool Street and go down Hanbury Street and visit a place called Second Home. It's absolutely extraordinary what's happening. And the reason they're there and not on the M4 is because that's why they want to be close to the city. You just can't find that kind of building in the heart of the city. But that's more and more what people want to use and occupy as they grow their businesses, mature their businesses, and hopefully then move into the core But there's no boundary there. You just amble along. It's absolutely fantastic.
Eric, you're going to speak about culture?
Just to say that I think we should take the lobby of Tower 42 and make it look like second home. It's possible. It's beautiful. Go for it.
Come on round.
Just to say that in Canary Wharf, the meeting is finished and they've told me I can slack off.
One more question? At the back.
John Adams of Deloitte Real Estate. Just to observe, as a corporate, effectively, with 8,000 people in the city, I could see that the traditional desire to have a strong ground floor presence of a corporate is being rapidly outweighed by the desire to create space where people can interact and have that sort of serendipity experience with like-minded professionals and clients, and we can't actually move quickly enough to meet that really strong demand for more informal spaces, activating the ground floor of the buildings that we occupy. And that's one of the reasons why we took a building in Clerkenwell for our digital business, because we recognise the need for quite a different type of space. So I think from a corporate point of view, I can see the scales moving very quickly away from a traditional view on presence at the ground floor to something which is much more open and interactive.
Can I make a comment on that?
I'm going to give you the last word in a minute,
Thank
Despina, but in case anybody else wants to come in. But I've observed the corporate coffee shops in quite a number of professional service companies in particular. Right, anybody else, and then a last word to Despina. A last word.
Well, I was going to say something different, but I will use it as the last word because it fits, actually, to the Deloitte point. I mentioned that this notion of agile working is the norm. Mobility, permeability, agility means that the corporate office building will now be the manifestation of the culture and ethos of the organization. It's no longer about a brand name or words, but it is about living those values. So effectively, it is the high-tech coffee shop which links it back to the legacy of the city as the coffee shops for knowledge exchange and creating business. And I think, that is what the past and the future of the city is about.
Okay. Can I thank the panel? Can I thank Despina? Can I thank the audience? I think this has been a wonderfully informative and good-humoured discussion. We've certainly learned a lot from it, and I'll have a word with my planning chairman afterwards. So thank you to everybody, particularly the panel and Despina.
Thank you.